The cigarette smoke curled between her fingers like a question mark as Bette Davis delivered the line that would become Hollywood legend. "Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night." It was 1950 and the cameras were rolling on All About Eve, capturing not just a performance but a philosophy that had defined her entire career. Those ice-cold eyes, magnified by the close-up, held 30 years of battles fought against a system that had told her she wasn't pretty enough to be a star, yet couldn't deny her the talent that made prettiness irrelevant. At 52, Bette Davis was at the peak of her powers and the beginning of her decline, though she would never admit to either. The woman who had once been dismissed by Warner Brothers executives as lacking star quality had transformed herself into the most formidable actress of her generation through sheer force of will and an understanding that Hollywood's definition of beauty was just another limitation to be demolished. "I survived because I was tougher than anybody else," she would later say. And the survival had required more than just professional endurance. It had demanded the complete reconstruction of what it meant to be a leading lady in an industry built on the worship of conventional femininity. Bette Davis had made herself into something unprecedented, a female star whose power came not from her ability to be desired but from her refusal to be diminished. The bumpy night she had warned audiences about in All About Eve was more prophecy than dialogue. The decades that followed would bring personal betrayals that made her professional battles seem gentle by comparison, culminating in the ultimate cruelty, being denounced by her own daughter in a tell-all book that painted her as a monster incapable of love. But on that soundstage in 1950, Bette Davis was still the undisputed queen of Hollywood drama. The woman who had proven that intelligence could be sexier than beauty, that strength could be more compelling than sweetness, and that some performers were simply too large for the boxes the industry tried to build around them. The question that had haunted her since her first screen test, whether she was actress enough to overcome not being beautiful enough, had been answered definitively. But the cost of that answer was only beginning to be calculated, and it would be paid in loneliness, family estrangement, and the bitter knowledge that even the most successful revolution leaves its leader standing alone on the battlefield, surveying the wreckage of everything they had to destroy to win. The New England that shaped Ruth Elizabeth Davis was a world of rigid expectations and carefully maintained appearances, where young women were expected to cultivate accomplishments but never ambitions, beauty but never boldness. Born on April 5, 1908 in Lowell, Massachusetts, she entered a family that valued propriety above passion and conformity above creativity, though they would later discover they had raised a daughter who was allergic to both. Her mother, Ruthie Davis, was a woman caught between two centuries, old enough to remember when women's options were severely limited, young enough to glimpse the possibilities that were beginning to emerge for the next generation. Ruthie's own frustrated artistic ambitions would be projected onto her daughter with an intensity that was both nurturing and suffocating, creating the foundation for Bette's lifelong understanding that love and achievement were inextricably linked in ways that were often destructive. The divorce of Bette's parents when she was still a child introduced her early to the concept that life was fundamentally unstable and that security could only be achieved through personal strength rather than external circumstances. The economic struggles that followed taught her that charm and beauty might open doors, but only talent and determination could keep them open long enough to matter. The young Ruth Elizabeth, she wouldn't become Bette until her teens, inspired by Balzac's cousin Bette, was an awkward child whose intelligence was more obvious than her attractiveness. The prominent eyes that would later make her famous were considered too big for her face by conventional standards, drawing comments from relatives who whispered that she might be interesting, but would never be pretty enough for the kind of marriage that was expected of girls from her background. But what she lacked in conventional appeal, she made up for in sheer force of personality. Even as a child, Bette possessed the kind of magnetic intensity that made people notice her whether they wanted to or not. Those oversized eyes that seemed like liabilities would one day become the most recognizable feature in Hollywood. But first, they had to learn to see past the limitations others tried to impose on them. The discovery of her theatrical gifts came during school productions, where her natural tendency toward drama found a constructive outlet. The same intensity that made her difficult in everyday social situations became compelling when channeled through character and story. For the first time in her life, being different was an advantage rather than a liability, and the applause that followed her performances provided a taste of the validation she had been unconsciously seeking. The decision to pursue acting professionally was both natural progression and conscious rebellion against the limited options available to young women of her background and era. While her contemporaries were being groomed for marriage and domesticity, Bette was developing ambitions that would require her to compete in arenas where few women had ever succeeded on their own terms. The training at the John Murray Anderson School of Theatre in New York provided her with technical skills, but more importantly, it introduced her to the concept that acting was a craft that could be studied, improved, and mastered through discipline and intelligence rather than just intuition and natural gift. This understanding would prove crucial throughout her career as it gave her confidence in her abilities that didn't depend on external validation or conventional measures of success. The early years in New York theater were marked by the kind of struggle that separated serious performers from those who were simply playing at being artists. Bette learned to live on almost nothing, to audition constantly, and to develop the thick skin necessary to survive in a profession that specialized in rejection. But she also learned that persistence could compensate for a lack of natural advantages, and that preparation and professionalism could distinguish her from competitors who might be prettier but were less committed. The roles she began to win in regional theater and small New York productions were often unsympathetic characters, women who were too smart, too ambitious, or too honest for their own good. These parts gave her an education in playing against audience expectations and finding the humanity in characters that other actresses might have dismissed as simply villainous. The skills she developed during this period would prove essential when Hollywood began offering her similar roles on a much larger scale. The movie contract that brought Bette Davis to Hollywood in 1930 was both the opportunity she had been working toward and the beginning of a battle that would define the rest of her career. Universal Studios had signed her based on her theater work, but when she arrived in Los Angeles, the executives took one look at her and immediately began having second thoughts about their investment. The screen test that followed was a disaster by conventional Hollywood standards. Bette's intense acting style, which had worked well on stage, seemed overwrought and artificial when captured by cameras that were designed to reveal rather than magnify emotion. Her distinctive features, which photographed as interesting rather than beautiful, failed to conform to the studio's template for leading ladies. The feedback was swift and brutal. She was not star material. But Universal had already invested in her contract, so they began the process of trying to transform her into something more commercially viable. The hair, makeup, and wardrobe departments worked to soften her edges and minimize the very qualities that made her distinctive. The acting coaches tried to teach her to underplay emotions and rely on her physical appeal rather than her dramatic intensity. The result was a series of forgettable performances in forgettable films that pleased no one and convinced the studio that their initial doubts had been justified. The move to Warner Brothers in 1932 was presented as a fresh start, but it quickly became apparent that the new studio had many of the same preconceptions about what constituted star quality. Jack Warner and his executives were willing to use Bette Davis in supporting roles in secondary parts, but they remained skeptical about her potential to carry major productions or command significant audience loyalty. The breakthrough role that changed everything came almost by accident. When the leading lady originally cast in of Human Bondage, 1934, became unavailable, Bette lobbied aggressively for the part of Mildred, a cruel and manipulative waitress who destroys the man who loves her. The role was exactly the kind of unsympathetic character that other actresses avoided, but Bette understood that it represented an opportunity to demonstrate her range and commitment to her craft. The performance she delivered was shocking in its honesty and intensity. Rather than trying to make Mildred likable or sympathetic, Bette played her as genuinely cruel and selfish, creating a character who was compelling precisely because she was so thoroughly unpleasant. The critics were unanimous in their praise, and audiences responded with the kind of fascination that comes from seeing something genuinely original and unexpected. The transformation in her career was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, the qualities that had been considered liabilities, her intelligence, her intensity, her refusal to conform to conventional expectations of feminine behavior, were being recognized as assets that distinguished her from every other actress in Hollywood. The studios began offering her leading roles in major productions, and audiences began requesting her specifically rather than simply accepting her as part of the package. But success brought its own complications. Bette quickly discovered that her newfound star status came with expectations and restrictions that were almost as limiting as the obscurity she had left behind. Warner Brothers wanted to capitalize on her success, but they also wanted to control it, offering her roles that were variations on the themes that had made her famous while discouraging her from exploring different aspects of her talent. The legal battle that followed was unprecedented in Hollywood history. In 1936, Bette Davis filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers seeking to break her contract and gain the right to choose her own roles. The case was ultimately unsuccessful in court, but it established her as a force to be reckoned with and demonstrated to other actors that the studio system's power was not absolute. More importantly, it forced Warner Brothers to negotiate with her as an equal partner rather than simply as an employee, leading to better roles and more creative control. The Academy Award that came in 1936 for Dangerous was both vindication and burden, confirming her status as one of Hollywood's most important actresses, while also creating expectations that every subsequent performance would need to live up to that standard. The second Oscar for Jezebel in 1939 established her as the most honored actress of her generation and gave her the leverage to demand the kinds of roles that would allow her to continue growing as a performer. The late 1930s and early 1940s represented the peak of Bette Davis's career and her influence within the Hollywood system. Films like Dark Victory, The Moon, The Letter, and now Voyager showcased her ability to find depth and complexity in characters that might have been one-dimensional in the hands of less skilled performers. She had become the actress that other actresses studied and the standard against which female dramatic performances were measured. But the success that had taken so much effort to achieve was beginning to exact its own price. The intensity that made her performances so compelling also made her personal relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. The men in her life often found themselves competing with her career for her attention and emotional energy, while the women around her struggled to understand someone whose ambitions extended so far beyond conventional domestic satisfactions. The marriage to William Grant Sherry in 1945 was both an attempt at normalcy and acknowledgement that her emotional needs were more complex than her professional achievements could satisfy. The relationship produced her only biological child, BD, but it also highlighted the fundamental incompatibility between Bette's public persona and her private desires for connection and stability. The feud with Joan Crawford that began during this period was initially professional but quickly became personal, as both women recognized in each other a reflection of their own fears about aging, irrelevance, and the limited shelf life of female stars in Hollywood. Their rivalry was played out in the press and on movie sets, creating a narrative of mutual hatred that was more complex and more tragic than the simple jealousy that reporters preferred to write about. The collaboration on Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962 was both career resurrection and final confrontation, bringing together two actresses whose best years seemed behind them for a project that would prove both still had the power to surprise and disturb audiences. The film's success demonstrated that there was still an audience for the kind of uncompromising dramatic performances that both women specialized in, but it also marked the beginning of the end of their relevance in a Hollywood that was increasingly youth-oriented and interested in different kinds of stories. The 1950s had brought Bette Davis some of her most memorable roles, including the career-defining performance in All About Eve that would become her most quoted and referenced work. The character of Margot Channing was perfectly suited to Bette's particular combination of vulnerability and strength, allowing her to play a woman who was both powerful and fragile, confident and insecure, wise and foolish in ways that reflected the contradictions of her own personality. The famous line about fastening seatbelts became more than just memorable dialogue. It became a statement of intent that seemed to capture something essential about Bette's approach to both her career and her life. She had always believed that comfort was the enemy of growth, that the best performances and the most meaningful experiences required a willingness to embrace uncertainty and risk everything for the possibility of achieving something extraordinary. But the bumpy night she had promised audiences was beginning to extend beyond her professional life into her personal relationships, particularly with her daughter BD, who was struggling to establish her own identity while living in the shadow of one of Hollywood's most famous personalities. The tension between them was exacerbated by Bette's inability to separate her role as a mother from her identity as a performer, leading to a dynamic where even family relationships felt like extensions of her public persona. The 1960s brought both creative triumphs and personal disappointments as Bette struggled to remain relevant in an industry that was rapidly changing around her. The films that had made her famous seemed increasingly old-fashioned compared to the naturalistic performances and contemporary themes that were beginning to dominate serious cinema. Yet she continued to work, taking roles that might have seemed beneath her earlier standards, because she understood that visibility was essential to maintaining influence. The horror films and melodramas of this period were often dismissed by critics as beneath her talents, but Bette approached them with the same seriousness she had brought to her greatest roles. She understood that acting was a craft that required constant practice, and that even modest films could provide opportunities to explore different aspects of character and emotion. The audiences who continued to seek out her performances were rewarded with work that was often more interesting and complex than the material might have suggested. The personal relationships during this period were marked by the same intensity that characterized her professional work, but with increasingly diminishing returns. The men who were attracted to her fame often proved unable to handle the reality of her personality, while those who could match her intelligence and strength were often intimidated by her reputation and public persona. The loneliness that resulted was profound and became an increasing source of both pain and creative inspiration. The stroke that partially paralyzed her in 1983 marked the beginning of a decline that was both physical and professional, but it also revealed the depths of her determination to continue working despite obvious limitations. The performances she gave during her final years were necessarily more restrained than her earlier work, but they possessed a dignity and grace that reflected her lifelong commitment to the craft of acting and her refusal to be defeated by circumstances beyond her control. The publication of her daughter BD's memoir, My Mother's Keeper, in 1985 was perhaps the cruelest blow of Bette's entire life, as it portrayed her as a manipulative and abusive mother whose career success had come at the expense of her family's emotional well-being. The The book's revelations were devastating not just because they were public, but because they came from the person whose love and approval Bette had sought most desperately throughout her adult life. The response she crafted to her daughter's accusations was characteristically direct and uncompromising. Rather than attempting to defend herself or explain the complexities of balancing career and motherhood in an era when few women had attempted both, she simply stated that she had given everything she had to both her art and her family, and if that wasn't enough, it was a tragedy for everyone involved. The final years were marked by a series of health problems that would have forced a less determined person into retirement, but Bette continued to accept roles and make public appearances almost until the very end. The voice that had delivered thousands of memorable lines was weakened by illness, and the eyes that had been her most distinctive feature were dimmed by age and medication, but the essential force of her personality remained undimmed. The death that came on October 6, 1989, in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France, marked the end of an era in Hollywood history and the loss of one of the last connections to the golden age of studio filmmaking. The obituaries that appeared around the world focused on her professional achievements and her role in expanding the possibilities for women in entertainment, but they could only hint at the personal costs of her particular kind of success. The funeral was attended by representatives from every phase of her career, but the most notable absence was her daughter BD, whose refusal to reconcile with her mother had become one of the defining tragedies of Bette's later life. The service reflected the contradictions that had characterized her entire existence. She was mourned as both beloved icon and difficult personality, celebrated for her achievements while being remembered for the relationships that had been damaged in their pursuit. The legacy that Bette Davis left behind was complex and multifaceted, extending far beyond her individual performances to encompass her role in changing how the entertainment industry thought about female talent and ambition. She had proven that actresses could be successful without conforming to conventional standards of beauty or behavior, and her battles with the studio system had established precedents that benefited countless performers who came after her. The continued popularity of her films, particularly All About Eve and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, suggested that her particular brand of uncompromising dramatic performance had achieved a kind of timelessness that transcended the specific cultural moment in which it was created. New generations of viewers continued to discover her work and to find in it examples of acting that was both technically accomplished and emotionally authentic. But perhaps the most lasting aspect of her influence was the example she had provided of what it meant to be an uncompromising artist in a commercial medium. She had shown that it was possible to maintain artistic integrity while achieving popular success, and that the most memorable performances often came from actors who were willing to reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature rather than simply providing entertainment or escapism. The song Bette Davis Eyes that became a hit in 1981 transformed her distinctive gaze into a cultural reference point that extended far beyond cinema, confirming her status as an icon whose influence extended into areas she had never directly entered. The lyrics captured something essential about her screen persona, while also acknowledging the power that had made her such a compelling and sometimes intimidating presence throughout her career. The biographical films and documentaries that continued to examine her life and work revealed the ongoing fascination with someone who had managed to create a public persona that was both larger than life and recognizably human. The complexity of her character, the combination of strength and vulnerability, ambition and insecurity, talent and loneliness, provided material for endless analysis and interpretation. The feminist movement that emerged during the later years of her career found in Bette Davis an early example of a woman who had refused to be limited by social expectations or industry conventions. Her battles for creative control and professional respect had anticipated many of the struggles that would define women's liberation in other fields, making her a retrospective pioneer in areas where she had never consciously sought to be a leader. The acting techniques that she had developed through decades of professional experience became part of the curriculum at drama schools around the world, ensuring that her approach to character development and emotional truth would continue to influence performers long after her death. The intensity and commitment that had characterized her work set standards that remained relevant even as acting styles and film technology evolved in directions she could never have anticipated. The personal relationships that had been so difficult during her lifetime became the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation as biographers and critics attempted to understand how someone who could portray love and loss so convincingly on screen had struggled so persistently to achieve lasting happiness in her private life. The contradictions were never fully resolved, but they added depth to her legacy by demonstrating that artistic achievement and personal fulfillment were not necessarily connected in the ways that might be expected. The letters and interviews from her final years revealed a woman who had achieved everything she had set out to accomplish professionally, while remaining haunted by the sense that something essential had been lost along the way. The price of refusing to compromise her artistic vision had been paid in loneliness and family estrangement. But she never expressed regret about the choices that had made her career possible. The influence that Bette Davis wielded over subsequent generations of actresses was both direct and indirect. Visible in performers who consciously modeled themselves on her approach and in others who absorbed her lessons about the importance of intelligence and emotional honesty without necessarily acknowledging the source. The permission she had given women to be difficult, demanding, and uncompromising in pursuit of their artistic goals continued to inspire performers who faced similar challenges in their own careers. The critical reevaluation of her work that began in the years following her death revealed depths and complexities that had sometimes been overlooked during her lifetime, when her personality and public persona could overshadow analysis of her actual performances. The recognition that she had been not just a successful actress but a genuine artist whose work deserved serious study added another dimension to her legacy and ensured her place in the pantheon of cinema's most important performers. The museum exhibitions and retrospectives that celebrated her career provided opportunities for new audiences to encounter her work without the baggage of contemporary gossip and controversy, allowing her performances to be evaluated on their own merits rather than as extensions of her public persona. The response from younger viewers who discovered her films through these presentations confirmed that her appeal transcended the specific cultural moment in which she had been most famous. The continued relevance of the issues she had confronted, the tension between artistic integrity and commercial success, the challenges faced by women in male-dominated industries, the costs of refusing to conform to social expectations, ensured that her story remained more than just historical curiosity. Each generation found new reasons to study her career and new lessons to draw from her particular combination of triumph and tragedy. The final assessment of Bette Davis's life and career revealed someone who had fundamentally changed what it meant to be a female star in Hollywood, while paying enormous personal costs for that transformation. She had proven that women could be successful without being conventionally beautiful, that intelligence could be more compelling than charm, and that audiences would respond to authentic emotion even when it was uncomfortable or challenging. The bumpy night that she had warned about in All About Eve had indeed lasted for decades, encompassing professional battles, personal struggles, and the ultimate betrayal by the daughter whose love she had sought throughout her adult life. But the turbulence had also produced work that continued to move and inspire audiences long after the specific circumstances that created it had been forgotten. In the end, perhaps the most fitting tribute to Bette Davis was that she had achieved exactly what she had set out to accomplish when she first arrived in Hollywood as an awkward young woman from New England. She had wanted to be interesting rather than pretty, and she had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. The eyes that had once been considered too large for conventional beauty had become the most recognizable and quoted features in cinema history, proof that the limitations others tried to impose could be transformed into advantages through talent, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept anyone else's definition of what was possible. The legacy she left behind was not just a collection of memorable performances, but a redefinition of what female power could look like in America's most influential cultural medium. She had shown that women could be both strong and vulnerable, both ambitious and human, both successful and deeply flawed without losing their essential authenticity or their ability to connect with audiences who recognized something of themselves in her struggles and triumphs. "Hollywood always wanted me to be pretty," she had observed late in her career. "I wanted to be interesting." The choice she had made between those two possibilities had shaped not just her own destiny, but the destinies of countless other women who followed in her path, proving that the most lasting beauty comes not from conforming to others' expectations, but from having the courage to be exactly who you are, regardless of the consequences.